everyone, and welcome to today's event. It's wonderful to have you here with us today. My name is Philippa Duthie, and I'm the director of RSA Oceania. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm broadcasting, the Gubbi Gubbi and Turrbal people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Collectively, we stand in footsteps millennia old. Wherever you're joining from today, please join me in acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the places represented here today, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture the land. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 7th event in our series, Reclaiming the Future, co-hosted by RSA Oceania and the RSA Sustainability Network. In this series, we look at how we can nurture our ability to think long and create a culture of intergenerational and planetary responsibility. Inspired by Roman Krznaric, we've been on a journey to explore what it means to be a good ancestor. We've heard from Indigenous philosophers, futures thinkers, political theorists, regenerative practitioners, economists, and storytellers. And beneath all of these conversations, like a subterranean undercurrent, has been the concept of time. Today, we push the boundaries of human understanding and experience to explore the distant temporalities of deep time, the vast temporal stretches that both predate and will outlive human existence. Joining us to discuss this fascinating topic is our wonderful panel of deep time experts. BBC Future senior journalist and founder of the Long-termist's field guide, Richard Fisher, journalist and author of Notes from Deep Time, Helen Gordon, and Berggruen research fellow and author of Deep Time Reckoning, Vincent Ialenti, who has pre-recorded his session for us just due to the time difference. For those who attended last time, you'll know that I'm hoping to start each of these sessions with a short passage just to fire up our temporal imaginations. Today's passage is from Footprints in Search of Future Fossils by award-winning author and literary scholar David Farrier. So in his book, David says, in the final part of The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot drew inspiration from accounts of the Shackleton expeditions to Antarctica, in which exhausted members of the party would hallucinate that there was always one more person present than could be counted. When I look ahead up the white road, complains one of the poem's many disembodied voices, there is always another one walking beside you. The entire atmosphere now bears the marks of our passage, like a vast geochemical trace fossil of the journeys we have taken and the energy we have consumed. When the last residue of our carbon finally leaves the atmosphere, humanity will have lived and evolved through another 4,000 generations. Language and communication will have altered beyond our ken. How people in the year 102,000 CE talk and think, what they consider to be art or music, may well be unrecognizable to us. What it means to be human may even have changed in ways we cannot imagine. But as that change unfolds and our descendants pull away from us, like the ghostly third figure in Eliot's poem, we will accompany them. Perhaps no one will be around to read our traces, but nonetheless we are, everywhere, constantly, and with the most astonishing profligacy, leaving a legacy that will endure for hundreds of thousands or even hundreds of millions of years to come. We are conjuring ourselves as ghosts who will haunt the very deep future. An evocative passage to start our discussion today. And with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker for today's event, Richard Fisher. Richard is a senior journalist at BBC Future and founder of the Long-termist's field guide. Recently, he spent an academic year at MIT in the US as a Knight Science Journalism Fellow, where he researched the roots and causes of short-termism and the psychology and philosophy of long-term thinking. Richard, welcome.
Hi, thank you. I'm glad you started with that quote from David's book. It's a fantastic book. I'd really recommend picking it up. It really expanded my mind when I read it. I'm delighted to come and speak today about deep time. I've always been fascinated by the human relationship with deep time. When I was a boy, I collected rocks and fossils and visited caves in nearby Derbyshire. On family visits to the village of Castleton, we'd visit this road. It was on the side of a hill called Mantor that was closed off to cars. And this road looks like an earthquake has like ripped it apart. It's got sheared tarmac and crevasses across its surface. For decades, the land on the side of the hill has been slipping downwards beneath it ever so slowly, like warping and reshaping it. Eventually, in the 1970s, the council gave up making repairs and had to close it. I think it's always struck me as it's a striking example of how the Earth's slower pace intersects with faster human activity. And it also shows that geology usually wins. Looking back on those kind of childhood experiences, I suppose encounters like these planted the seed of an interest in earth sciences in my mind. It was a subject I studied at school and at university before I moved into journalism at New Scientist and then the BBC. So deep time has always been there. But my recent focus on the long view, which I write about for the BBC in my newsletter, and the non-fiction book that I'm currently working on, began shortly after my daughter was born. So this was back in 2013. One of the things that blew my mind as a new parent was realizing that our new baby, Grace, could potentially grow up to live to see the 22nd century. So she will be 86 years old in 2100, which is of course not impossible with advances in healthcare and longer lifespans. So, I in those early sleepless days, I imagined her on New Year's Eve, welcoming the new century in with her own family as the fireworks explode in the sky. It's easy to forget that there are millions of citizens of the 22nd century already among us. In the year of Grace's birth, 140 million other people were born worldwide, more than twice the population of France. Looking ahead, almost 11 billion more children will probably begin their lives before 2100. And if they're lucky, a handful of them will live through to see the 23rd century. They'll be over 100 years old, but a few will get there. So through our family ties, the deeper past and future, are far closer to our lives than first appears. Later, though, I find myself troubled also by this daydream about Grace at the end of the century. Throughout my career as a journalist, I've encountered the date 2100 within various news stories, reports or forecasts, but they're rarely kind of happy ones. The kinds of things they read like rising seas and wild weather threaten to drown cities by 2100, or humanity has a 1 in 6 chance of extinction by the end of the century. The year 2100 is so often depicted as a milestone within a worsening world, a marker for society's collapse or, decline, sometimes even a barrier we may not pass. These stories of future climate turmoil, biodiversity collapse, and technology disruption often feel like really far away in time, but we are connected to that turning point at the end of the century by only 1 or 2 generations. The 18th century political thinker, Edmund Burke, once wrote, society is a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. Unfortunately, it seems that the partnership between the generations is breaking. If our descendants were to diagnose our generation's most harmful habit, they would observe a dangerous new form of short-termism, particularly in the West. In the early 21st century, the now commands all our attention, and any sense of kind of deeper past and future is filtered only through the events of the current moment. The world that we live in is saturated in information, and standards of living have never been higher. Yet so often it's a struggle to shift attention beyond the next news cycle, political term, or business quarter. If time can be sliced, it feels like it's getting ever finer. But what makes this short-termism so pernicious, in my opinion, is that so much of it is invisible. Those afflicted by it might be best described as time blinkered. This is not the deliberate, conscious short-termism that we sometimes need to solve a crisis or enjoy life's pleasures. This is a short-termism that's hidden from view. It's so embedded and widespread that people don't even know it's there. So over the past few years, I've become fascinated by the following questions. What led us into this period of time blinkered thinking, or more specifically, what led Western societies, because it does seem to be a particularly acute problem for Western style democracy and capitalism. Why do people psychologically think about the past, present, and future in the way that they do? And what does it take to become more long-minded stretching one's perspective over deep time. Today, I don't want to go into the causes of short-term thinking in much detail because we're focusing on deep time, which is a much better topic, I suppose. Instead, I want to focus on a few lessons I've learned about what it takes to embrace the long view. To be honest, it can be daunting to reflect upon deep time. There's a really big gap between our lives and these much longer timescales. Nature measures time in geological eras and evolutionary adaptations. Civilizations measure in religions and empires, societies and states and revolutions. But a human being, the units of significance are still years, generations, or at most our short lifespans. Deep time is just so far removed from daily experience, and contemplating it can feel like looking into a bottomless pit. The more that you extend the mind into longer timescales, the more you realize just how fleeting a single life can be. Even John McPhee, who helped to popularize the term deep time in the 1980s, he was skeptical that human beings could grasp the concept to its full extent. He wrote, "People think in 5 generations, 2 ahead, 2 behind, with heavy concentration on the one in the middle. Possibly that is tragic, and possibly there is no choice." However, I don't think it's impossible to embrace a longer view. The best description for the emotional experience of deep time that I've encountered comes from Edmund Burke once again. Early in his life, Burke, he also wrote about the concept of the sublime. He wasn't thinking about deep time exactly. It was a bit too early for that, but rather the experience of encountering something far bigger than yourself. Something that's seemingly infinite, like an ocean stretching off into the horizon or a mountain towering above you. He called this seemingly infinite perspective a delightful horror. Isn't that a great term? Delightful horror. So what's delightful about deep time? So I kind of believe that embracing a longer view can have myriad benefits if we dare to give it our attention. I think this includes a secular, almost spiritual sense of perspective. In times of crisis, it tells you this is going to pass. Deep time gives us a greater awareness of our place within history, nature, and the universe. It also, I think, arguably gives a sense of priority and an understanding of what matters over very long timescales, and also the awareness of how to do right by our ancestors and by our grandchildren. So over the past few years, I've kind of sought out as much as I can others who are seeking to understand deep time. These are long-minded individuals, organizations, and cultures scattered across the realms of capitalism, governance, art, history, literature, philosophy, and technology. What unites them, though, is the discovery that a long-termist lens brings lots of positive benefits to themselves and others. They've kind of shown me why embracing a deeper perspective of time can be transformative. So who are they? Well, one of them is Vincent Ialenti, who'll be speaking in the video a little bit later about a nuclear waste storage project in Finland. And I've also been delighted to discover Helen's book recently, which reveals the kind of profound geological perspectives you can gain by looking at the ground beneath your feet. But there are many, many more. There are organizations you probably know about, the Long Now Foundation in San Francisco, which is building a clock that will take for 10,000 years, art projects that aim to communicate deep time through symbolic routes, music compositions that will play for a millennium, or books that won't be read for at least a century. And then there are the indigenous thinkers who we've heard from elsewhere in the series, who emphasize the importance of intergenerational reciprocity, or the religions that emphasize long-term rituals. But new deep time thinkers are emerging all the time in different fields. I just want to tell you about one group of them today, because I've got limited time. Over the past few years, I've been influenced by a new school of thought called long-termism, which began as a philosophical idea at Oxford University here in the UK, but is now turning into a full-blown movement. It's rooted in the idea that future people matter, and that we may be at a turning point in our history where we are uniquely placed to affect their fate for better or worse, and that we therefore have an ethical obligation to ensure that they have good lives. So this is a deep time perspective, but it's much more focused on the future than it is on the past. One way that these long-termists think about this deep future is not through the units of years, centuries, or millennia, but through how many human lives might exist within that time span. So, it's about how many future people could in principle exist and what we owe to them in terms of our ethical obligations. So question is, how many future people will there be? You know, how many are we talking? So a few years ago, I had a go at working this out myself. I performed some like rough calculations for the BBC to get a handle on like the, you know, the huge scale of future generations. So you can make a few assumptions. If you assume that the birth rate stays at this century's average and the global population to remain stable, you know, remain stable for 50,000 years, you know, these are all kind of assumptions. You can only do your best to kind of guess what's going to happen over the next 50,000 years. But if you assume that, then there stand to be 6.75 trillion more people born. And that is more than 60 times the number of human beings that have ever lived. So, you know, you can visualize that really, you know, roughly like with these objects that I found in my daughter's toy box this morning. So, you know, here's a marble. This is everyone who is alive today, you know, 7.8 billion people. Here is a bouncy ball. This is everyone who's ever lived, you know, and died. That's 100 trillion people. And here, by my best estimate, is the future, a Tinkerbell ball, which is 6.75 trillion people. So this kind of calculation of the relative numbers of past, present, and future people that I did was like, you know, it was picked up and widely shared. Like Roman Krasnarek, who Philippa mentioned, like wrote about in his book, The Good Ancestor. I also discovered recently there was a cartoonist for the New Yorker that, you know, reproduced it in one of her illustrations. But the thing is, enormous as that seems, 6 trillion people, I now realize I probably underestimated it. According to the long-termists who have got to know over the past few years, the scale of future generations could actually be far, far bigger than that. So for starters, like, you know, our species has got the potential to last longer than 50,000 years into the future, which is one assumption that I made. You know, in fact, you know, the long-termists believe that there's, you know, every reason that our descendants, you know, will go on for much, much longer than that. The typical mammalian species, you know, lasts for 1 million years. So why not us? So, and then if these great-great-grandchildren extended into the very far deep future were to stay on Earth for a really long time, let's say until the sun dies, then the total number of unborn people could exceed 100 trillion. And that's almost 1,000 times like more than all people who've ever lived. So the figure of 100 trillion, and that's not even the upper limit. Like if our descendants expand out into the cosmos, you know, then the numbers get even bigger. So if they settle the solar system, the number of lives, according to one calculation, could be 10 octillion. That's 27 zeros, you know. If they spread out across the Milky Way, you know, there could be 9 more zeros on top of that. So it's, I mean, these numbers are like just really difficult to get your head around. It took me a while to kind of understand them. And what I tried to do was trying to understand them in physical terms. So if you imagine that each page of a book was a person, right? So we've got 2 handy books here. Here is Vincent's book, and here is Helen's. So each page is a person. The book of 100 trillion people would have to be 10 million kilometers thick. You know, I mean, Helen's book is thick, but it's not that thick. I mean, it's 10 million kilometers is a bit away. You know, that's 26 times the distance to the moon, and around 250 times the circumference of Earth at the equator. You know, you can use other like metaphors, like temporal metaphors. So, you know, if 100 trillion, you can imagine each person's life was a second, you know, ticking by on a clock. It would take, you know, to count to 100 trillion, it would take 3.2 million years. The thing is, when you get to octillions of people, though, it gets even crazier. You know, it's just too big a number to represent with book pages or seconds, so you need other metaphors. My favorite analogy involves a raining vegetable. So bear with me on this. So imagine there is a blizzard of peas falling from the sky, like it's a pea rainstorm, and it coats the entire surface of the Earth, the land surface of the Earth, up to about 4 foot. So all the continents are buried to 4 foot. So that blanket of peas across all land would be a sextillion peas, which is 21 zeros. So that doesn't get you to octillion, that's not enough. So imagine then that the oceans froze over and the peas fell on top of the ocean as well. That would get you to a septillion, which is 24 zeros. That's still a bit short. But to get to an octillion, you would need to rain them over 250,000 more planets the size of Earth. Like, and each pea is a person. That's a lot of future people, and it's a lot of peas. Of course, like thinking about humanity's deep time trajectory with this kind of numerical, mathematical lens alone is not the only way to think about the long view. I'm very much an advocate for like a multiplicitous approach to deep time, you know, drawing on the wisdom of art, culture, religion, science, and more. I mean, if you look hard enough, you can find long-minded people trying to find a long view in all these different places. You know, we've heard from them already in this speaker series, and you'll get more insights from Helen and Vincent today. Ultimately, though, I believe a deep time perspective need not be something we need to look away from because of its daunting scale. There's much to be gained by embracing it. So, you know, if I had to summarize like the single most powerful thing I've learned from my research into the long view over the past few years, it's that the future could be good. You know, it could be really good. It could even be better than we can imagine. It feels almost like controversial to say, you know, say this when there's like so many of the world's problems at the moment. You know, they seem so unfixable, and we're locked in crisis after crisis. And I acknowledge there's no doubt that it would be foolish to ignore the grand challenges we face in the 21st century. You know, we need to be present-minded as well as long-minded. You know, after all, not all short-term thinking is bad when you're facing a crisis or difficulty. But the long view is, I believe, you know, it gives cause for hope, you know, across our deep time trajectory. Sometimes when I talk about humanity's path over the next 1,000 or million years, the response is, well, we won't be here, will we? You know, and it's true, perhaps we won't, but that doesn't mean we should give up. Doomism, in my opinion, is just another form of short-term thinking, which is, in the worst case, it can justify apathy, doing nothing at all. Of course, we also shouldn't be Panglossian or utopian, hoping for the best. Ultimately, you know, we can't be passive and we can't ignore the future. The long view reveals that there are actually multiple trajectories ahead. You know, some of them are good, some of them are bad. The key is that, like, with the long view, we gain the kind of the ability to steer away from the very worst paths. A deep time perspective can be extremely daunting. It may always feel like Burke's delightful horror to us, but I believe there's a lot to be gained by embracing it, and we also owe it to those octillions of future people to do so. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Richard. That was a delightful talk. I really, really enjoyed it. And I really love the hope that you gave us at the end, and the equation of doomism as short-term thinking. I'd love to pick that up later on in the questions. But for now, let me pass on to our next speaker for tonight, or today if you're in the UK, which is Helen Gordon. And I'm scrolling through my script. Helen Gordon is the author of Notes from Deep Time, Landfall, and with Travis Elborough, Being a Writer. She has written about nature, science, clothes, and books for various newspapers and magazines, including The Economist's 1843 magazine, The Guardian, and Wired UK. A former Granta magazine editor, she currently teaches creative writing at the University of Hertfordshire. I hope I said that right. I probably didn't. You can.
Thank you so much, Philippa. Hertfordshire. And hello, everyone. And thank you to Richard for that fascinating talk, even if I'm now like octesept, those numbers are sort of scaring me and it's too early in the morning. But thank you, and looking forward to your book when it comes out. So yes, I'm Helen Gordon. I'm the author of Notes from Deep Time, which is an exploration through deep time of our past and future worlds and the men and women who work with deep time. So that's the jacket there. It's about deep time, but it's very much got to focus on geology, not exclusively, but that's sort of where I ended up focusing a lot of my research. When I was preparing for today, I was thinking that, you know, if we want to think more about the long-term future, which was part of the brief for what we're discussing today, we perhaps need to first of all, spend a bit of time practicing getting our heads into a deep time space, which is perhaps not a natural place for us to be. a place where, as Richard has talked about, time is measured not in seconds, minutes, hours, years, but in hundreds and thousands of years, in the millions and the billions. And practicing, I think, practicing deep time thinking, that can involve looking backwards into the past as well as looking forwards into the future, or indeed practicing looking backwards to enable us to look forwards. I mean, scientists do this. They spend a lot of time thinking about the past in order to think about the future. Talking here about making use of analogues. So we can't take a time machine into the future to see what happens when, for example, you dump lots and lots of CO2 into the atmosphere. We can build models, we can see what they tell us. But if we want real world data, information, we need to look back into the past to look for comparable events and see what happened. When I was researching my book, I saw this really sort of starkly visually laid out in a railway cutting in Leicester. And in this railway cutting, you have this really lovely sort of pale honeycomb coloured limestone, and it's filled with the remains of sea creatures, lots of ammonites and belemnites. And these are the creatures that were living during the Jurassic, when a shallow sea covered Leicester and many other places. And the thing that was striking to me as someone who's not in any way an expert in fossils was you just walked along, you looked down and you picked up a tiny ammonite. You walked on, you looked down, you picked up another ammonite. There were just so many of them. So testament to how much life was living and thriving in this Jurassic ocean. And then you get along the cutting and suddenly the pale honeycomb coloured limestone stops. And in its place, you get this really sort of dark blue-grey shale, sort of thin layers of shale, and you can't see any fossils in it. And this transition from the limestone to the shale is evidence of something known as the Tertian extinction event, when an estimated 1.5 to 2.7 trillion tons of carbon was released into the atmosphere, and the world warmed by around 5 degrees. So we've recently had COP26, right, in Glasgow, and we're talking about 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees warming. This was 5 degrees warming. As a result, one of the things that happened was that the oceans were depleted of oxygen and things died out, hence the fact that there's no fossils in the shale. And this is one of the events that's sometimes used to think about modern global warming and to think about what could happen in the future. So, okay, it now seems a little bit odd to make a jump between an extinction event and the subject of joy. But for me, not a scientist, one of the joys of writing notes from deep time was that engaging with the deep time past really changed and enhanced my experience of the landscape of now, the landscape that was around me. So looking at the world through the lens of deep time, I think the landscape sort of thickens around us. It's enriched in a way. So I look at a railway cutting in Leicester and I'm seeing not just some different coloured rocks, I'm seeing a story. I'm seeing a story about something that took place around 183 million years ago. And that sort of thickening of the landscape, that enriching of the landscape, I mean, obviously that happens everywhere, whether it's a railway cutting, a mountaintop, or indeed a street in the city. And when you look around, that the world you're seeing isn't the only world that's ever been there. And that's quite a magical, wonderful thought. I mean, my own interest in deep time began when I was doing a lot of walking on the North Downs, which is an area just south of London, hillsides. And I became interested in the formation of the landscape that I was spending all this time walking over. And the North Downs are made of chalk, which is a sort of a white rock that was formed underwater from the remains of these microscopic creatures dying and sinking down in the water column, and landing on the seafloor and being compressed and turning into rock. And so just this idea that the hillside I was on, with its beech trees and dog walkers and kind of prosaic suburban bungalows, the idea that once all this had been, well, this land had been underwater. This was once an ocean. I don't mean that the bungalows have been underwater, obviously. The idea that this land had once been an ocean just seemed really fantastical, sort of stupefying idea. This sense that you know that whenever you stand on chalk, you're standing where the sea used to be. And I love the idea that in deep time, everything is provisional. Nothing is stable, everything changes. Bones become rock, deserts become oceans, forests become cities. You can stand on just one piece of ground and know that so many different stories have played out there in the past. You know, it's been a swamp, a shallow sea, a mountainside, and all these past lives of the land, they leave their traces behind. So in the moment of now, you have all these different temporalities colliding, ghosts of past worlds. At the start of Notes from Deep Time, I talk about walking past a building site on Cambridge Heath Road in Bethnal Green in East London. Because of course, you know, geology can happen in the middle of the city as well as out in the countryside. And I was walking past this building site and a hole was being dug. It was the excavation, it was the foundations for a hotel that now exists there. And if you looked down into the hole, you saw all these different layers of rock. And each different layer of rock was a different story. So you were looking down into a hole filled with stories stacked on top of one another, deep time stories. There was the made ground, which, well, something the geologists call made ground, the top layer, which was a sort of a pale greyish, rubbly stuff filled with broken bits of brick and concrete and tarmac. And that's the stuff that in a city has been churned over for hundreds of years. It's human history, human remains, human stories, human time. And then below the made ground, there was a layer of sort of sand and gravel. And that was a layer of, between those two layers, you moved from human time into deep time, into this like bigger, weirder time scale. And the sand and gravel had been deposited around 2 million years ago during the Pleistocene epoch, when the River Thames flowed sort of through what is now Bethnal Green. So you step from human time into a story before the human story. And you can keep going down, and the next layer is London clay, which is a sort of thickly sticky, morose, dark brown rock, almost purple in places. And that tells us that around 55 million years ago, in what is today East London, there would have been a warm tropical sea with a lush green shoreline fringed with mangrove palms and magnolia, with a climate similar to present day Indonesia. And you know, that you could keep going down. Later on, you would have found the chalk. And so this hole is a sort of portal to other worlds. And it's also a portal to another way of thinking, to this deep time thinking that we've been talking about, and that Richard's been talking about. And I just, you know, remarkably, it's right there, right in the middle of the sort of the incessant hubbub of now. that envelops us, you know, the buses, the commuters going to the tube, the school children visiting, there's a museum opposite. This little portal to deep time. I think this kind of this creative, imaginative aspect of working with deep time is probably one of the reasons that I was drawn to it, or to geology as a way of thinking about deep time. I mean, I'm not sure that the scientists I interviewed would particularly be on board with me saying this, but it seems to me that if you're going to study deep time, and if you're going to study geology as an aspect of deep time, it does involve some element of creative imagination. So as a geologist, for example, you might be looking at a landscape and you're trying to figure out why a certain rock structure exists. What happened in the past to get it to that point? As the great 19th century geologist Charles Lyell put it, we may restore in imagination the appearance of the ancient continents which have passed away. So that idea is actually there within geology as a discipline, I would argue, right from its early days. And I think there's an almost playful element here, actually. When I think about these past worlds, I'm reminded of those first acts of imagination we make as children in play, where, you know, the little woods behind our house might become an enormous forest, or the local park is filled with dragons or dinosaurs. And to go back to the original point about forging creative pathways forwards, I think that imagination and playful imaginative experiences can be a really important part of that. The acts of playful, creative imagination. And I think something else that I think is worth thinking about is perhaps what stories we want to leave behind in the rocks. If we were to imagine a geologist 1 million years from now, what will they think when they reach the layer of rocks that's what remains of our moment in time? What are they going to find? What do we want to leave for them to find? You know, they'll find evidence of radionuclides, they'll find concrete, this new material, this new rock that never existed until humans existed. They'll find trace fossils, they'll find evidence of bioturbation, for example, fossilized tube tunnels. Finding a fossilized tube tunnel would be the equivalent of us finding the fossilized burrow of some creature that lived during the Jurassic. They'll find evidence of extinctions in the fossil record. They'll find evidence of creatures suddenly disappearing, suddenly moving from one place to across the world in a way that what didn't happen before humans started moving rapidly across the world. So what will all this add up to? What will the future geologists think? What will they think about us? What stories will they find that we've left them in the rocks? Thank you.
So beautiful. Thank you so much, Helen. And a lot of the points you made, I've been thinking about in my own, I suppose, explorations into deep time as well. So thank you so much for taking us to the to explaining the storied elements of deep time, I suppose. And actually, your talk reminded me of one of the quotes, which I'm just going to quickly read out from your book that really resonated with me, which was the conversation that you had with geologist Ruth Siddle, where you said that, you know, we may need the Earth, but 4.6 billion years of history shows us that the Earth doesn't need Homo sapiens. The Earth will recalibrate and something else will appear, but it won't be us. So I'm hoping that we can pick that up as a collective again in the questions in a little while. But for now, I'm just going to move on to Vincent's pre-recorded talk. And I will just scroll through my script once again to find Vincent's bio for you. So Vincent Ialenti is an assistant research professor at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. He holds a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from Cornell University. His new book, Deep Time Reckoning, which Richard's just shown you, and I also have a hard copy here. I have a soft copy of Helen's book, so I can't show you that, but I show you I have a soft copy and the audio version. So yeah, lots of books that we could share. And Vincent's book is an ethnographic study of how Finland's nuclear waste repository safety case experts grapple with distant future ecosystems and the limits of imagination. He is currently developing, in collaboration with the Long Now Foundation, a toolkit for nurturing a societal time literacy and for envisioning more long-termist, multi-temporal systems of governance. So just bear with me while I set up the video for you.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks for having me. I wish I could be with you in person, or at least interact in real time a little bit, but this is definitely exciting still. And today I'd like to explore a very specific kind of deep time imagination. You see, from 2012 to 2014, I spent 32 months conducting anthropological fieldwork in Finland. I was studying how the country's nuclear waste repository safety case experts reckoned with far future worlds. These experts developed forecasts of geological, hydrological, and ecological events that could potentially occur in Western Finland over the coming tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years. They combined techniques of analogical reasoning, quantitative modeling, qualitative scenario making, mechanical stress testing, and geological and ecological fieldwork. From these efforts emerged visions of distant future glaciations, climate changes, earthquakes, floods, human and animal population changes, and more. The safety case experts' goal was to persuade Finland's nuclear regulatory authority, and that's called STUK, to certify the construction of what, in the mid-2020s, is likely going to be the world's first deep geologic repository for spent nuclear fuel. But I'm an anthropologist, and my goal there was a little different. I was exploring how the safety case experts' engagements with the limits of time could be retooled into cognitive strategies that anyone can adopt to start imagining future states of our planet themselves. Thinking long-term, after all, is going to be crucial for facing down socio-ecological slow violences such as biodiversity loss, microplastics accumulation, climate change, antibiotic resistance, and so on. So before I could do all this, I first had to understand Finland's nuclear professional communities from the inside. So I took Finnish language courses, I immersed myself in Northern European life, I conversed with the nuclear experts in person, or read their technical reports, heard out their critics, visited them at work, and so on. I also grabbed coffee and lunch and drinks with them whenever possible. And I ended up recording 121 interviews. The outcome of my journey was the experimental book that I published with MIT Press about a year ago, and it's titled Deep Time Reckoning. The book is a response to how most of our 21st century societal institutions and life rhythms are calibrated to these dangerously short-term time horizons. These include 24/7 cable news cycles, corporate quarterly earnings reports, political election schedules, sudden stock market shifts, throwaway consumerism, knee-jerk culture wars, fickle pop culture trends, contingent gig economy, employment contracts, and momentary social media attentional economies. To counter these shallow time pressures, my book advocates deep time thinking as a sort of a discipline of self-cultivation. Right? It's a practice of self-improvement akin to jujitsu or music or meditation or art or fasting or athletics. Yet the deep time discipline I advocate is rooted anthropologically in the very particular ways that Finland's nuclear waste experts engaged with our planet's tomorrows. And today, in the same spirit, I'm going to suggest we dive back into the safety case experts' forecast and try to absorb and then retool and then redeploy at least some of their insights as techniques for navigating futures near and deep. This shift in temporal awareness towards deep time is going to be essential in the coming years during our current Anthropocene moment of political, ecological, and epistemic instability. So let's start deep time dreaming together. But first, what was the safety case, and why does it matter? So the safety case, it detailed the repository's technical design And then it forecasted the facility's fate over the coming millennia. Safety case biosphere assessors made projections about Western Finland's lakes, rivers, mires, and forests sprouting up and disappearing and changing in shape and size over the next 10,000 years. They considered far future soil erosion, floods, and fires. They envisioned a 3-kilometer thick glacial ice sheet during the next ice age, slated to occur 50 or 60,000 years from now. They envisioned potential seismic events, such as earthquakes or rock shears, that could occur as the ice sheet retreats after the next ice age. They modeled how the current Olkiluoto Island site will eventually become an inland site. In their models, a glacial rebound or uplift when the last ice age eventually causes Finland's shoreline to widen further into the Baltic Sea. It causes Finland's mainland to sort of engulf this island into itself. And then they explored more pessimistic scenarios too. These included models of how 14 different kinds of radionuclides could escape from the repository, travel through groundwater flows, get released at all these different points on Earth's surface, and then even disperse in above-ground ecosystems and bioaccumulating at times in plants and animals along the way. And the biosphere assessors then made these conservative assumptions that 6,000 far future people, all eating local food, are going to live in Western Finland, and then suggested that some of them, a critical group, are going to face a greater likelihood of exposure due to unlucky food selections. Still, the safety case ultimately argued that, as everyone knew it would, that all these far future people are going to be safely below Stuke's stringent regulatory dose limits, even under these really unlikely future circumstances. The safety case, after all, was made to persuade. Now, social scientists like me are usually quick to underscore how repository performance assessments are reductive constructions or oversimplifications of the future. And that's because they are. Predicting distant future worlds is an impossible task. However, I'm an anthropologist, and I see my job as trying to peek inside my informant's worldviews and apprehend their thinking's internal logics, no matter how irrational they may initially seem to me. And early on in my fieldwork over in Finland, something became clear. Most of them pretty much agreed that their task is impossible, and they saw it as sort of obvious that their models are reductive or somewhat subjective or mediated by the historical, cultural, and organizational contexts in which they were produced, right? So some even said their models are just educated guesses, and it seemed when I was there that deep time reckoning required deep time humility. For the safety case experts, their models are these pragmatic projections that are flawed, but they're born out of this ongoing self-critique and multidisciplinary collaborative visioning and these multi-decade cycles of revision, and more revision. Yet their endeavors are also enabled by a broader Finnish public known for its high levels of trust in domestic civil servants, police officers, educators, ministries, journalists, regulators, legal systems, engineers, and scientists. Finland was a country largely unburdened by the grisly history of domestic military industrial settler colonialism, radiological experimentation on unwitting populations, and atmospheric nuclear weapons testing that had reduced public trust in the US context. In fact, when I first arrived in Finland in 2012, the country had already completed this highly participatory, community consent-based nuclear waste repository siting procedure. And the idiosyncrasies of Finnish expertise culture became even clearer once I returned to the US in August 2014. The US in just the past decade or so had seen national security experts' failures to stop 9/11, an Iraq invasion based on false pretenses about WMDs, this terrible BP oil spill, this shoddy FEMA response to Hurricane Katrina. Economists had failed to predict the global financial crisis, and there's these disheartening disclosures of mass NSA digital surveillance, right? And even public enthusiasm for Silicon Valley was giving way to these concerns about digital privacy, cybersecurity hacks, and the monetization of socio-political division. And in the years ahead, it got worse. Post-truth, alternative fact become mainstream buzzwords. Who gets elected. And this exacerbates kind of an already dangerous political epistemic condition that had been brewing for years, really. And in my book, I call it a deflation of expertise. And as Bruno Latour, the sociologist of science, has observed, this disintegration of a shared, agreed-upon public sphere of facthood has kind of opened the doors for, corporations or lobbyists or fringe experts to reframe public understandings of science. And in this context, it was striking a different chord when my fellow social scientists are moving to deconstruct or destabilize this supposed hegemony of objectivity, truth, or facthood. And these same intellectual strategies were, after all, increasingly used by right-wing populists to sow doubt about climate change models or COVID epidemiological models, or even just basic claims to journalistic rigor. So these days, expert insights are dulled by corporate knowledge management red tape, adjunct hiring trends at universities, publish or perish productivity pressures, and they're warped by these really short-term contingent gig economy research funding contracts. So when slow-moving, long-sighted expertise and inquiry recedes from view, the public debate can enter into this sense of futurelessness, right? Societies can develop this manic fixation on the present that incessantly shoots down proposals for envisioning better tomorrows and better worlds. So as the Anthropocene takes hold, right, deep time reckoning remains more important than ever. But that's not what we're seeing right now. So let's resist this moment of nihilism for a moment, and let's return to the safety case experts' long-sighted projections and try to see if their deep time techniques have a little something to teach us. So gazing into far future Finlands reshaped the safety case experts' intellectual sensibilities and expanded their imaginative horizons. They routinely took findings from these retrodictive or past-gazing sciences and then stretched them into predictive or future-gazing sciences. This made them uniquely comfortable with navigating uncertainty and epistemic excess. My informants also adopted a stepwise approach of developing updated versions of the safety case that, we can hope, grow more robust over the years. They called these successive versions iterations. The first was released in 1985, another in 1992, another in 1999, another in 2012, and still another one's going to be released, submitted to Stuke later this year. Each iteration was seen as tentative, a work in progress, and a new one was to be assembled every 10 or 15 years until the repository is planned to be closed or decommissioned around the year 2120. And now that's a long project, 2120. And along the way, the safety case experts embrace something sort of like what philosopher Emmanuel Levinas once called infinition, which is a cognitive state in which radical complexity is sort of allowed to overflow the thoughts that are trying to think it. Some safety case experts integrated self-critique into, and even admissions of vast uncertainty into their own reports. They did so with methods called knowledge quality assessment or sensitivity analysis, made reports about it. And the idea was that their models' claim to legitimacy or credibility is going to be bolstered, not undercut, by just admitting to and then transparently detailing as much as you can all the different reductive assumptions found in your knowledge. And they also understood that Finland's futures always have to be seen in the plural. The safety case didn't put forth this one single overconfident master model that perfectly represents the far future. Instead, it forecasts this multiplicitous series of projections, right, about all these different potential future events, each weighted with different likelihoods of occurring. And as my informants saw it, venturing these kind of multiple parallel visions of tomorrow is going to tell us something, but it'll never tell us everything about far future Finlands. Yet, these models weren't enough either, right? So they also needed to venture what they called multiple lines of reasoning. So this means convening several different teams of experts, each with different disciplinary backgrounds, to create a safety case that is, to use philosopher Adrian Curie's terms, methodologically omnivorous. If readers don't trust the safety case's models of far future ecosystems or hydrogeology, they can just instead turn to its defense of the repository's engineered barriers, or they can turn to its reports on mechanical strength tests done on its copper nuclear waste canisters. If they don't trust those, they can instead turn to these qualitative scenarios, which are detailing, far future Finlands in prose. And this is kind of a strategy of strategic redundancy, right? Of integrating the logic of all these different fields to hopefully reduce the likelihood that any one inaccurate assumption in them doesn't invalidate the wider range or the broader thrust of the argument. So this is a self-reflective, self-critical, multi-timescale sensibility that I think is uniquely well suited for navigating radical ambiguity, uncertainty, and unknowability. It's a refreshing counterpoint to the myopic scientism that's produced a lot of the intractable problems of our planetary ecological crisis. And that's why my book encourages readers to get more comfortable with deep time awareness by experimentally adopting safety case sensibilities, right? So this means approaching the safety case as this toolkit, right? Pragmatic toolkit for rubber banding the imagination back and forth across time. So I'd like to close by retooling a safety case technique, just as I do in my book, and kind of redeploy it and play it out on a new terrain in a new space, just like I do in Deep Time Reckoning, my book. And what emerges here is a speculative mental exercise that encourages readers to reflect more broadly on our position in deep geological planetary timescales. So here we go. So one line of safety case reasoning involved the power of analogy. Some safety case experts studied a present-day glacial ice sheet in Greenland as an analog for making approximations about a far future glacial ice sheet in Finland during and after the next ice age. Others studied a bronze cannon from the shipwrecked 17th century Swedish warship Kronen, which was submerged for almost 3 centuries in Baltic seawater. They studied it as an analog for how Finland's copper nuclear waste canisters may or may not corrode in the future. In both cases, they used these present-day objects, right, as stand-in features for making these comparisons, these reductive, simplified comparisons across time. The glacier and the cannon can thus be understood as what the historian Gabriel Hecht calls interscalar vehicles. And these are objects that can draw us to transport our intellects across deep time and human time through geological space and political space all at the same time. So in my book, I challenge readers to replicate these transtemporal mental gymnastics in their own everyday lives. Let me give you an example. When I lived in Washington, D.C., I learned how in 1922, excavators were clearing ground for the Mayflower Hotel, and they found fossilized bald cypress trees 20 feet below the surface, right? These trees grew roughly 100,000 years ago. And today, 4 bald cypresses planted in the mid-1800s grow in Lafayette Square right near the White House. Deploying them as interscalar vehicles as I walk home from work, these trees become analogs that I can kind of tap into to help me think more widely across time. They give me these ancient tree imageries I can envision when reimagining the nation's capital analogically as a prehistoric swamp or marshland. And stretching my momentary now, right, into these wider histories and futures is what this accomplishes for me. And it does so by transposing safety case experts' analogical reasoning methods onto this new terrain of an everyday thought experiment. And I think doing this can help nurture deep time thinking during a moment of shallow time discipline and planetary ecological ruination and political epistemic uncertainty. My book has tons of little techniques like these. But with this one, we just have to remember that analogs, like safety case models, have a little something to teach us, even though they can never offer us anything even close to certainty about the future. For instance, there's many limits to what a bronze cannon, right, submerged in the sea for centuries, is really going to tell us about a copper nuclear waste canister that's buried in this granite bedrock for millennia. They're not perfect copies of each other, but what they do offer is sort of a concreteness and materiality that's at least more tangible than empty navel-gazing speculation. And if extracted from their context in the nuclear industry, I think these sort of long-termist techniques can become a foundation for a more hopeful or forward-looking or time-literate outlook for our current planetary crisis. That's it for today. Thank you, and keep on deep time dreaming.
Oh, that was Vincent's wonderful pre-recorded talk, and I really recommend that you read his book. It's full of lots of really interesting discussion and reckonings, as he mentioned. So yeah, now we're on to the question part, audience participation and question part of the discussion. So if you have any questions for our wonderful speakers today, please remember to post them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can before the end of the session. And I can see a couple of people have already started to do that, which is fantastic. So I'm going to start us off, I think, just with a couple of questions that I have myself, and then I'll move on to the questions that we've got in the chat. So I'm really keen to, I think, pick up on this notion of Richard's that that doomism is another form of short-termism. I know that Anthropocene despair is kind of a term that's been bandied around, and I just wanted to see if Helen had any thoughts on this, and if you wanted to. Basically, I suppose if you're also optimistic about the future and humanity's potential role in it, and the potential to get to all those trillions, hundreds of trillions of plus people that could potentially come that Richard mentioned.
Thank you. Well, I mean, going back to the quote from my book that you read out earlier, I agree with Ruth Siddle, the geologist. I'm very hopeful about the Earth. I think the Earth will be fine one way or another. Lots of big cataclysmic events have happened before in history, and life has gone on in some form. The Earth has recalibrated. About the humans, I mean, I had an interesting conversation with a scientist called Jan Zelašević, who has done, he recently retired actually, but he was sort of at the forefront of the geologists who were looking at the concept of the Anthropocene and trying to decide whether the Anthropocene should be formally adopted as a unit of geological time, which actually still hasn't happened, though obviously the term is used in different ways by different people for other purposes. And he has written that the ethical implications of the Anthropocene may stimulate transformational thinking to enable us to better integrate into the Earth system. And he's talked about how the new geological unit could one day promote hope rather than despair. So I like to think about that with a more positive mindset. So yes, the idea that the Anthropocene could be sort of the kick we need to stimulate transformational thinking to enable us to better integrate into the Earth system.
Thank you, Helen. Richard, did you want to add anything to your comments from earlier?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess what I don't want to do is suggest that being overwhelmed by the current problems of the climate and everything that we face is, I'm not dismissing that as an emotion or as a perfectly natural response to kind of like the steep problems that we face. I think it's I personally would rather look forward with hope and potential to help us steer through our most difficult problems rather than, and then, as I say, give up. I think there's certain terms that I've learned recently that have kind of I've tried to latch onto to give me hope. There's a term called existential hope, which is the opposite of existential risk. So existential risk is the potential for everything to end. Existential hope is the it's opposite. And there's another word I learned called a eucatastrophe, which apparently Tolkien came up with. A eucatastrophe is the opposite of catastrophe in that it's at the end of the battle when everything seems kind of terrible. A new army comes in and saves the day, and that's kind of like an amazing turn of events for the better. You could argue over the very long deep time view that the origin of life or the first multicellular organisms, that was a eucatastrophe in terms of like the flourishing of life. So put humans to one side. I mean, there have been kind of amazing turns for the better in lots of ways throughout a deep time history. The question of like whether we will be around in a million years. I mean, you know, I honestly don't know. I think the thing that I've kind of taken from the people I've spoken to is the idea of trajectories, that there are good ones and there are bad ones, and you know, it's within our kind of ability, because the future is not yet defined, to kind of collectively steer towards the better ones. You know, I think that's where I think doomism is a problem. It suggests that let's just party till the end of the world and give up. And so I would just discourage that view. Although partying is good at the same time.
I guess on the other hand of that, Tim's asked really, how do we stop the contemplation of deep time from becoming an escape from present dangers? As you said earlier, Richard, we must be long-minded as well as present-minded. So yeah, how do we stop using this as an escape?
I think that's a really good question. I've got a good quote that I've kind of keep going back to. Robert Macfarlane, who wrote Underland, A Deep Time Journey, he wrote, there is a perilous comfort to be drawn from deep time. An ethical lotus eating beckons. What does human behavior matter when Homo sapiens, you know, will have disappeared from Earth in the blink of a geological eye? Viewed from the perspective of deserts or oceans, morality looks absurd, crushed to irrelevance. However, then he then goes on to say, we should resist such inertial thinking. Indeed, we should urge its opposite. Deep time is a radical perspective, provoking action, not apathy. I think that kind of sense of deep time being an escape, I think is absolutely right. And I think you can get lost in it, and it can be it can be something that is only available to the privileged as well. You know, I think if you're facing a crisis and difficulty, it's very difficult to kind of think about the very far future or the very deep past. And so I think it's always worth acknowledging that. I think it's possible to do it when you have the comfort to be able to do it. But yeah, I definitely don't see it as a form of escapism. I think being able having that cognitive flexibility to move between being long-minded and present-minded, I think is the key.
And I think from a kind of geological perspective as well, it's sort of almost, in some ways, doesn't lend itself to escapism, because the deep time past is just full of examples of groups of organisms existing and then not existing. So if anything, it's like lots and lots of little wake-up calls saying, hey, you won't be here forever. These guys, maybe they thought they were here forever and they weren't. I mean, if we think about, obviously, the most famous example, the dinosaurs. When you think about dinosaurs, one of the first things we think about is the fact that dinosaurs don't exist anymore. You know, they were the apex predators, they ruled the world, and then one day they didn't, with the exception of birds, obviously, still being around. So yeah, so I think, you know, thinking about deep time can be a series of little reminders, or big reminders and warnings, as well as a sort of the danger of escapism.
It's fascinating, actually. One of the, I spoke to Vincent earlier, and one of the questions that we were discussing was the difference between nostalgia and deep time. And I suggested that nostalgia was, you know, much a kind of desire for a simpler time, and that deep time was much more complex, more scary, much more, you know, something obviously that is a bit more difficult to comprehend, and because of that we have the fears that you mentioned earlier, Richard, towards that kind of juxtaposed feelings of kind of exhilaration, but also fear. But it's interesting the way our thinking has shifted, I suppose, in this time of greater crisis, that deep time thinking is becoming more of a almost our new nostalgia, in a sense. This kind of in the sense that we can possibly see it as a form of escapism. But just following that through, I'm going to bring in Steph's question. Helen, you mentioned imagination is needed, and Steph says that she agrees. But what kind of imagination?
And that's an excellent and quite flummoxing for me question. Well, creative imagination. Imagination to try to step beyond the boundaries of what we can emotionally respond to, I suppose. And then sort of thinking back to John McPhee, which Richard mentioned, this idea that, you know, you can emotionally respond to generations before and after, and it's tricky to do much more than that. And the idea, I suppose, that it's probably when we are emotionally engaged that we make the big, difficult decisions and changes to our lifestyles in ways that we may need to do to combat present challenges. I'd be very interested to hear from Steph and what she thinks about that, what she sort of means by different forms of imagination. It's a fascinating idea.
Steph, you're welcome to jump in and ask your to answer verbally if you like, if you're still here.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to put Steph on the spot. I was just interested.
That's okay. While Steph's thinking, I might move on to Richard and see if he has any extra thoughts or additions around that.
Well, I suppose in the book that I'm writing, I've tried to kind of, as much as possible, step beyond my own perspective and the own limits of like my own, you know, imagination by seeking kind of other perspectives. So, you know, I've been trying to kind of get to know what you know you can learn from indigenous imagination, what you can learn from, you know, the mathematical philosophical one that I talked about earlier. You know, there's kind of a spiritual religious view of long-term time. There's this scientific imagination. I think, you know, science can be creative too. So I think, you know, and then of course creative imagination, you know, there are all sorts of different symbolic ways that like we can project the mind into the far past or the far future through stories, through you know, art projects and so on. So you know, I don't think there's one route, but I think being aware of where you come from, where you sit, and then what you can learn from others who are completely different in terms of your view. Like, you know, there've been questions in the chat which have, you know, I think are great questions about different views of time, for example, like about dream time rather than like the Western kind of industrial view of time. You know, these are the things that I've tried to kind of wrestle with, because I'm aware that my view of time is rooted in my own kind of geological background and my work as a science journalist and the fact that I live in the UK. So I think a global, multiplicitous view of imagination is the way to go.
Thank you, Richard. And I can see that Steph's still processing. Steph, are you ready to jump in, or did you want us to move on to the next question? You can come back. I think we'll come back. It's all good. Lewis asks, do either of you, not feel that our desire for future exploration of other worlds is a complete waste of time? And in this question, I'm reminded of something that Norm Sheehan, one of our earlier Indigenous speakers, said about the fact that Earth, regardless of, you know, how we feel about space exploration, is our home. You know, we have this kind of emotional, I suppose, pull towards it. But yeah, what are your thoughts around colonizing other worlds to escape our present catastrophes?
I can answer this. I can try. I think the space exploration has been somewhat kind of tarred by the recent kind of raft of billionaires doing it, and with space exploration, I'm more attached to the kind of 1960s NASA version of space rather than what Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are doing. You know, because I'm well aware that it feels insensitive and not the right time to be doing these kinds of things. I guess my view is that space exploration in the past has offered us new perspectives on the planet itself. You know, images like the pale blue dot. You know, back then, like, space exploration was aligned with the aims of environmentalism. You know, the pale blue dot and the experience that astronauts feel of being in space, the overview effect, you know, helped kind of us develop greater awareness of what a precious planet we live on. And whether we should go and like settle Mars, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best way to go, especially when we've got robots. But I see space exploration as a way of kind of reflecting on the planet that we have.
Helen, did you want to jump in on that question? No? No, that's all good. I can see we've got lots of, as you say, Richard, lots of beautiful comments about, different conceptions of time. I suppose I might ask you something else that that came up in my conversation with Vincent, which was about death and how our recognition of our own mortality feeds into any kind of discussion about deep time. Do you feel that short-termism is basically an expression of death denialism in our current day Western culture? Either of you, feel free to jump in.
Do you want to go, Helen? Or no? Okay. So I guess I think there are lots of reasons. I don't think that's the only one. I think I guess another way of putting it is that if we were in denial of death and we thought we lived forever, then we might do more things that were more long-termist. So I'm not. When I've been researching my book, it's not that one of the primary causes of short-termism that I've observed. I think more happens through the salience of the present rather than the contemplation of absence of experience in the future, if that makes sense. So I think death is important, but I do think, I could go back to the culture question. I think there are other cultures that have a more healthy relationship with death than the West does. Better links with ancestors, like the idea of walking backwards into the future, being aware of what your ancestors gave you. This idea of intergenerational reciprocity. There are fascinating psychological experiments that show that if you prime people to think about sacrifices made by your ancestors, you're more likely to do beneficial things for your descendants in these kind of choice-based lab experiments. I think that's a fascinating, tantalizing finding, which suggests that contemplating more about how you fit within a chain does help you to think about deep time.
Yeah, and I mean, I just think it still just goes back to the fact that, or at least my brain brought up within a sort of a Western system, is just struggles to conceptualize. Again, going back to the generational thing, I can easily imagine giving up something that I need to give up in order to help avert the climate crisis for my daughter now. I find it much harder to think about giving something up for her grandchildren. It's just, there isn't that connection there. And I think that kind of ties back to the, and I think in the same way, conceptualizing life after we're not here is difficult. Not philosophically, but just emotionally difficult.
Very true. We're coming to 5 minutes to time now, so probably time for just a couple more questions. If anyone has any burning last questions, please post them in the chat and I'll try to get to them next. But I just wanted to ask you both, while we have you, if you had one piece of advice to leave us with on how to be a good ancestor, which of course is what the series is about, what would it be? Helen, did you want to go first?
I think thinking about ways to communicate with the future is really interesting. When I was researching my book, I also, like Vincent, I went to Oncolo, and I also spoke to people who were working in a similar French program, and they were interested in the idea of how do you warn future generations of the danger of buried nuclear waste. And they were looking at issues of okay, we could assume that in X amount of time, no languages currently spoken today will be understood by anyone. So how do we warn people? And they were looking at lots of different strategies, which are kind of fascinating. So yes, this idea of thinking about communication with the future. And you know, I suppose, again, looking at the way that people, scientists, look back at the past for help with the present and help with the future. And obviously for most of the past there aren't written records, but kind of imagine if there was some way of devising that. So yeah, I don't know, something about communication.
I mean, just to pick up that point about communication, I think that's a good point. I think the one way that I think sometimes people think about it is like, what legacy are we leaving? And so some people take the view that I'm going to build a library or a monument, or you know, I'm going to pass something, an heirloom to future generations, and they're going to look after it. In my book, you know, I describe this as the Patek Philippe strategy. So there's a famous Patek Philippe. They're a watchmaker. They've got an advert that they run, and it says you never really own a Patek Philippe watch. You just, you know, you're keeping it for your grandchildren, and then that's one way of doing it. You know, it's legacy-based thinking. I guess in terms of being a good ancestor, I'm more inclined to take a more collective approach and give people the agency to make their own choices, rather than necessarily give them something that they have to shepherd through the ages into the future. So, you know, I think the collective approach, you know, not just collective today, you know, in the present, but what, you know, the Edmund Burke approach of, you know, society as a partnership across the generations. I think we need to be careful not to remove agency from our children. I think that's the key. They need to be able to make their own choices and chart their own trajectories into the future.
That's a really good point. Thank you, Richard. And one we actually haven't heard from any of the speakers so far on this series. So something we can all come away with and yeah, contemplate. And communication as well. We haven't spoken about that, but that is something that I was really fascinated in reading both your book, Helen, and Vincent's book as well. The idea of communicating across, yeah, just hundreds of thousands of years is a really fascinating topic. And unfortunately, we are at time, but of course you can dive into either Helen's book or Vincent's book or Richard's work. Richard's got a wonderful stack of articles that he's curated and he's written himself, and he's also, of course, publishing a forthcoming novel, I hope I'm allowed to say that, which you can look out for in the future. So lots of learning that our audience can come away with. And I just want to thank Richard and Helen so much for joining us today for the 7th event in our series, which is swiftly coming to a close. Unfortunately, next session is actually our last session for this series, which is a bit sad, but it's been a wonderful learning experience with everyone. So I'm so pleased that you've stayed with us on this journey. And of course, if you enjoyed this event, please do register for that one. And also you can check out the previous events on our YouTube channel, which I think Alex is going to has already posted in the chat, which is wonderful. Yes, please look out for those. And that conversation that I mentioned with Vincent will also be released as a podcast shortly. So I will follow up with an email to everyone so you can have a listen to that also retrospectively. So thank you to everyone, to our speakers, to our audience for attending this session, and to Alex for doing the tech for me. To finish up, please unmute yourselves and say farewell, just to connect us across time and space. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.